The Genesis is about marriage. And last week we learned that Genesis is about children as well. Today we're going to look at a new and old form of family, and that is blended families. Blended families are persons that have remarried and can either be with or without children. Now, I realize that many of you are not in blended families, and as a part of this message, I hope that it will be a time of learning and a time of deepening your understanding and your compassion for those that are seeking to bring together a blended family for a lifetime commitment. I also realize that there are some of you that have been touched by blended families, and so I hope that this may bring hope. I hope that it will also bring some healing into your life as well. I want to encourage you to turn to the inside of your bulletin and to fill in the blanks as we work our way through. That this may not only be a reminder of this message, but you might be able to come back to it during your time of prayer and meditation with God this week as you hear clearly Him speak to you not only this morning, but speak to you in the very midst of life's circumstances this week. The term blended family is for those that have brought together their two separate families. In a Pew Research survey, 42% of all adults said that they have a step member, a stepbrother, stepmother, stepfather, or stepsister. Current estimates are that 40% of all married couples today are the result of a blended family, of bringing together families from a previous marriage. Blended families are not a new phenomena. In fact, if we look historically in the United States, blended families were actually more prevalent more than a century or a century and a half ago. Part of the reason was because of the shortened lifespan during that period in the history of our nation. But the other was because of the mortality rate for mothers while giving birth as well. What we find is that blended families are not only becoming more prevalent today because the divorce rate has up to 50%, but we're also finding that as you look at God's Word, and I have to tell you that this is probably one of the biggest insights and surprises as I got into the book of Genesis and began to really consider that if we're going to minister to the people in our community, we need to talk about families and talk about blended families. I never realized how many blended families there really were in the Bible. Part of that was because I just never looked through that lens at the families in the Scriptures. But what we see is that there are blended families almost from the very beginning of time. And most sociologists believe that blended families may become the most predominant form of families in our culture in the next few decades. The task today is to give you a message not only filled with information and teaching, but one of hope as well. And I have to confess that as I looked at blended families throughout the Scriptures, I could not find a single positive example where it ended well. But we know that our God is a God of second chances. And we know that our God is a God of hope, and we know that our God is a God of healing and God of reconciliation. And we know that as we look around our culture and around our city, that there are successful examples of blended families, particularly when God is placed in the very midst of those families. Some of the examples of blended families in the Scriptures include Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, with whom Abraham had two different sons. But that marriage and family didn't end well as jealousy infiltrated it. And finally, Sarah sent Hagar packing out into the wilderness to die. And then there was Jacob. You remember Jacob. He fell in love with the beautiful daughter of his future father-in-law, but the problem was she was the second daughter, and as Jewish custom was, the first daughter had to be married off. So he had to marry the not-so-good-looking daughter so that then he could be married to the good-looking daughter. And when we look at what happened in that family, we see that it was destroyed by jealousy, by murder, by rape, deceit, and even favoritism. Then we get to King David. You remember that King David's first wife's name was Michal. But the Scriptures tell us that King David ended his life with probably 28, 29, or maybe even 30 brides The last is the infamous Bathsheba. We know that he had probably at least 10 sons and probably many more daughters as well. And one of those sons was Solomon. When we look at David's family, we see that it was touched by things like murder, rape, rebellion, incest, hatred, bitterness, and even anger. And then you know King David. King David gave birth to Solomon, and King Solomon, who was known to be one of the wisest, except for when it came to his own life, it seemed. You see, he followed in his father's footsteps and not only married one woman, but many other women. And the scriptures tell us that he may well have had in excess of 300 concubines. That is more than any man can juggle. And we find that in the latter years of his life, that King Solomon begins to sit down and to write a letter to his sons. We have that letter, the book of Proverbs. It was a book of advice, and it was basically saying this: don't make the mistakes that I've made in my life. And in that we see repeated over and over again, a man should only have one wife. And then at the end of his life, he writes these words: a man should cherish his first love, his first wife. He seems to have learned from his own mistakes and not wanting his children to make those same mistakes as well. We see that blended families are growing because the divorce rate is currently at 50%. I've shared with you previously that the divorce rate for second marriages is 60%, and the divorce rate for third marriages is 74%, and it only escalates from there. And so as more and more people marry and then divorce, what we find is that people don't become pessimists when it comes to love and marriage. And yet, 78% of all Americans who are single and have been divorced say that they still have hopes for love. They still have hopes for a lifelong commitment, for a marriage that will last a lifetime. And so they continue to search, and they continue to hope, and they continue to dream, and that ends up many times into a blended family. But this we know: blended families are not easy. They have stresses and they have challenges that other marriages do not. One man put it this way: if I had just worked on my first marriage, I would not have gotten divorced. But I was the same guy in the second marriage that I was in the first marriage, and I gave up too early. What we know is this: the blended marriages, the ones that end in divorce, usually do so after only 2 or 3 short years. But I don't want to be just one that pours down all this negativity and all of this dark information. Because we know that God is a God that wants you to be happy, and a God that has created you to love another, a God that has created you with a hole in your life so that you might be able to have and welcome someone in, and not just a short-term relationship or a series of relationships, but a lifelong commitment as well. The good news is that most remarried couples and families can beat the odds, and they can build a successful blended family if they understand what those challenges and what those stresses are. One survey found that blended families have twice as much stress as other families do in their life. So what are some of those stresses? The first is your ex, or your spouse's ex, to be more clear, because the fact is that you still have to deal with them. There's still issues of parenting, and there's still issues of finances that need to be dealt with. Second is false expectations. Many couples believe that when they bring together a blended family, that they're just like first families and they'll come together quickly, and yet they soon discover that that's not the case at all. That it not only takes months, but many times years to actually build them into a coherent family unit. It takes a long time for them to become a family. Many people believe that putting together a blended family is kind of like microwave cooking. You get it just like that. When in reality, putting together a blended family is more like making a roux. It takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of work, and it takes constant connection and paying attention to what's going on. Number 3 is your spouse's child. The reality is this: that a step-parent can never parent their spouse's children. They can be a good friend, but they can never parent. But many times that's the line that's crossed, and that's a lot of times where conflict arises. Fourth is finances, because many times the money's being split between 2 or sometimes even 3 households, and that creates stress. Fourth is that blended families are born of loss, failure, hurt, and grief. And that means that people bring baggage to this marriage and to this family, and it often gets in the way. Sixth is that everyone in the blended family has a previous history with ingrained living patterns and already built-in value systems. And the reality is that the two families brought together, those often are different from one another, and sometimes they're even virtual opposites of one another, and that creates stress and conflict. Seventh is the parent-child bond predates the bond between this new husband and wife. That between a mother and a father and their biological child, that bond has been going on a whole lot longer, and it is a whole lot closer. And so many times you have to weigh between this new marriage and the relationship with your child, and that creates stress. Eighth is that individuals often lack good conflict resolution skills. The reality of this is that that's one of the reasons why there was a divorce in the first place. And what we learn is that many times when people divorce is that they never really take the time to look inward. They never really take the time to get in a counseling relationship and to ask, what role did I have in the breakup of that marriage? And how do I need to do things differently in the future in any relationship down the line? And then ninth is that the past affects the present. You see, a dead and buried past is easily resurrected. And fear and assumptions are often based on what happened in the previous relationship, and they often erupt in the new relationship as well. Ron Deal says that there are 5 things that need to be dealt with if you're going to move in a healthy manner from a previous marriage into a blended family. First, you have to identify your ghosts. He says that your ghosts are that pain and that baggage that you bring to the relationship. Second is that you have to identify your fear triggers. That there are certain things that set off the fears that you're either going to be betrayed, you're going to be hurt, or the marriage is going to fail, or the new spouse will walk out on you like the first one did. And you have to understand what those triggers are, what those words are, those phrases, those feelings, those thoughts that trigger those fears that often may have no grounding at all. Third is you've got to interpret the present in light of the present rather than the past. It is too easy to interpret what your spouse is thinking and what they're doing in light of the way your first spouse acted and thought. And you've got to separate those two from one another. Fourth, you've got to wrestle with forgiveness. Some ghosts persist in the midst of the new marriage because you haven't fully grieved the past and you haven't forgiven your ex. You've got to forgive first before you can ever move forward. And then lastly, ask your current spouse for prayer. Open up your life and where your struggles are and where your pains are, what your lessons are and what you're wrestling with, and ask them to pray for you. Draw upon the power of God and the wisdom of God to help you to continue to grow and to heal and to move forward as you enter into this blended family and this new marriage. So what are the keys to blending two families together? First is you've got to clarify the expectations. It's foolish to think that the family members are going to come together like you did in your biological family. It just can't be done. It takes time, months, and sometimes even years for that to happen. It helps when the children can begin to see that you're willing to work it out, you're willing to stick it out, and you're willing to work through the pain and the disappointments as well as the challenges that are encountered. Secondly, make sure that you mourn the losses. You see, the reality is everyone is grieving in the midst of that original family. The children as well. And they need time to be able to grieve. That needs to make sure that you bring understanding, you bring patience, you bring wisdom, you bring comfort, and you bring love. Because all of those are essential. Third, build a team, build new alliances or friendships. When you're bringing together a blended family, you've got to spend extra effort and extra time in building those relationships, particularly with the stepchildren, so that you move forward as one coherent family. It takes time to build that, just as it does to take any team time to actually become a team. I mean, you can bring players together and you can try to create a team, but unless they work together, unless they have common goals, unless they have common interests, and unless they actually care for one another, you'll never be able to build a team, as you will never be able to build a family. Fourth, you got to focus on strengthening your marriage. One of the things that you have to understand is that when you bring together a blended family, the weakest link is this new marriage. You see, because you've had that connection with the children before, and that's lasted a whole lot longer, which means that you've got to be able to build the strongest marriage. And this is true whether this be your first marriage, second, third, or fourth marriage, that the greatest gift that you could ever give your children is a healthy, happy, and whole marriage relationship. It sets the tenor and the tone for the entire family. So you got to make sure that when you remarry and you bring together a blended family, that you keep the lines of communication open, that you continue to date one another, and most importantly, that you just don't deal with the business of what it means to be a family, but that you have fun together. You have fun together as a couple, and you have fun together with the kids as well. So make sure you strengthen the marriage. Fifth is you've got to help the children heal. Here's one thing that we've learned from the divorce rate is that many times children, when they're looking for reasons why mom and dad are no longer married, they point the finger at themselves. They think that somehow that they were a part of the puzzle. They may not be all the reason, but they were a significant reason of why the parents divorced. And here's the thing, and rightly so, most parents never tell the kids what was really going on behind closed doors. Their minds and their hearts are not ready for that type of information, nor is it really a part of what they need to know. But that ignorance also spurs this idea in their hearts and minds that perhaps they're part of the reason, they were part of the problem of why mom and dad are not together. When my kids were growing up, I remember it's about 10 years ago that there were several movies that came out with the hopes and expectations of children who had gone through divorce that their parents would get together, and that they would actually create these elaborate plans about how they would get their parents back in a relationship and back remarried to one another. And what they were doing in Hollywood was tapping into this hope of divorced children, when that they often hoped that mom and dad would be able to get back together, or that they would begin to solve the problems and whatever the issues were between them so that they could become a family once again. Maybe one of the most difficult things for a parent in a blended family is to allow those hopes and dreams to dissipate slowly in your child's heart and mind because you've moved on. Number 6, you've got to work hard at conflict resolution. You know this. I mean, all families have conflict, right? But here's the thing, blended families have even more conflict, because you're bringing different people back together with different experiences and relationships and different family dynamics. And what that means is that you've got to work hard at resolving conflict. And you've got to go the extra mile to resolve that conflict as well. And it means that the mother and father, the stepmother or the stepfather, need to set a new example of what it means to actually work through conflict. 7th, you've got to agree on discipline. This may be one of the biggest sparks of conflict in blended families, is that often the complaint goes something like this: well, you're a whole lot easier on your kids than you are my kids. Now, one of the things that you have to recognize, and it's the toughest lesson to learn in a blended family, I've seen this in my own family, is that you have to be able to recognize that as a step-parent, you can never parent your stepchildren. The best thing that you could try to do is to develop a friendship, a close friendship, to be best friends for them, but even that may not be possible. But here's the other thing, is that this new couple needs to sit down and they need to say, we're going to have the same set of rules and we're going to have the same set of expectations and we're going to have the same punishments for all the kids, regardless. Making sure that you're not only on the same page when it comes to discipline, because as we learned last week, to discipline your child means that you actually love your child, because you want them to learn what's right and what's wrong, and you want them to grow. Number 8, you've got to build a strong relationship with God and other believers. You've got to make sure that God is at the very center of your life and at the very center of your marriage. This means that you need to go to God every day in prayer. It means you need to read His Word and to draw upon His wisdom. It means that you also need to make sure that you as a couple are not trying to fly this plane alone, that you need to be with other blended families as well, because nobody understands the stresses and nobody understands the challenges of what it means to be in a blended marriage than other couples that are in a blended marriage. It needs to be an environment where you are loved unconditionally. It means to be an environment where you are accepted for who you are and where you can struggle in the midst of others and they can understand that and they can encourage you. It's in that type of group that you can begin to work together and to support one another and to live out Paul's words in Galatians 6:2, where he says that we are to encourage one another and support each other. Number 9, you've got to practice love and forgiveness. You see, here's the thing. You have first been loved by Christ so that you might then in turn love others. Love needs to be a part of every family, but particularly a blended family. You see, when we look at 1 Corinthians 13, a lot of times we fall into this trap in thinking that Paul is talking about love as a feeling, and he wasn't talking about that at all. Paul was saying love is action. Here's one of the deep, dark realities sometimes of blended families, that there are just some stepchildren that you may not ever really come to love. It may be just like mixing oil and water, but it doesn't mean that you cannot act lovingly to them, that you can't have their best interests at heart, that you can't do loving things for them. And in reality, isn't that the best parenting of all? That you have the best interest of the children and that you always act lovingly to them. But here's the other thing, is that you cannot have love apart from forgiveness. You see, this is why we turn to the cross and we remember that Jesus died on the cross for you and me. So it is that forgiveness that then we in turn are to give to others. And forgiveness has to be a part of a blended family because of so much conflict and so much struggle of bringing together so many different people with different expectations and with hurts and pains and grief and so many other dynamics. And so the mother and father need to make sure that they model forgiveness, unconditional forgiveness, so that the kids will begin to learn that no matter what they do or what they might say, how they may act out because of the grief and pain that is a part of their life and has forever marked them, that they are still loved and that they are still in a loving family. Practice love and forgiveness. And then lastly, don't be in a hurry. Becoming a family takes time. You know, and it's that patience, I think, that our society is worst at, isn't it? I mean, we want everything and we want it now. We are a product of our fast food society, but you cannot rush a family, just as you cannot rush cooking. You've got to be able to give it the time and the space. Be intentional about taking the long-term view instead of just taking the short-term view. And when the majority of blended families end in divorce after only 2 or 3 years, it means they only took the short-term view. You got to take the long-term view and to fight through the initial challenges and all of the stress so that you might have a marriage, one that lasts, one that glorifies God, one that blesses you, and one where you can come to understand true love and true forgiveness and what it really means to stick it out. Because the gentleman was right. If it's going to be a lifelong commitment, It's going to take way more work than you probably ever really imagined. But my hope and prayer is that the relationship that you are in right now will be one that will not only bless you, but will bless the world around you as you seek to live a life, a sacrificial offering given to the glory of God. Amen. Amen.